in that classic that everybody loves. Probably would make the top 10 list for movies in this room, The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy and her dog Toto are caught up from their farm in this tornado, and they're whisked off to the magical land of Oz, and there with the Scarecrow and the Tin Man and the Lion, Dorothy and Toto make their way along the yellow brick road to the Emerald City, seeking the almighty, most powerful, wonderful Wizard of Oz. And they get there, and they get into his chambers, and there's smoke, and it's a tall room, and there's curtains. And then they get a peek behind the curtain. And we discover that the wizard was nothing but an old man with smoke and mirrors. He wasn't all powerful. He wasn't powerful at all. He wasn't even really a match for the witch, really, when it came right down to it, if I remember the movie right. By the way, that was a horror show to me as a kid. Flying monkeys? Are you kidding me? Right? And witches and munchkin. I mean, the whole thing was scary as can be. You're familiar with the story. In Revelation chapter 4, John gets a vision of the courts of heaven, and as they peel back the curtain, which is really what Revelation means, it's an unveiling, peeling back the curtain. And when the curtain gets pulled back, what John sees is the great and powerful. He gets a glimpse of the one who sits on the throne in the eternal city, and what he sees blows his mind and our minds as well. We've been reading it this morning. What it was like to enter into the throne room of the living God, all-powerful, and it's not an old man with smoke and mirrors. He is not just the big guy upstairs. He is a God who is holy, holy, holy. That's who he is. An awe-inspiring God. And in this awe-inspiring throne room, we see that God rules over this universe, is in complete control, and absolutely worthy of our worship. And God as the true sovereign. God is the true sovereign, unlike human pretenders. I want to go back and read just the first verse again and look at it. John starts this vision and he says, "After this I looked up, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven." The door's not closed anymore. We are welcome. The door is standing open in heaven, and the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet. I don't have that voice to do, but come up here and I'll show you what must take place after this. He's going to reveal everything. And at once I was in the Spirit. I don't know if the Spirit was just in him before and now he's in the Spirit. I don't even really know how to explain that phrase other than to say this was a spiritual moment. Was this a real vision? Like, did Jesus come and physically stand before John like he did the Apostle Paul back when he was Saul in the midst of his transformation? We really don't know, but I think it was more than a fuzzy dream. I don't know about you, but I have these dreams. And lately they've been about my mom. And I don't want to get out of bed because it's just so good to see her again and to spend that time with her, you know. And I don't know if that's what John's going through, like he misses Jesus, and so he's given this vision. I think it's more than a dream. It's so vivid. My dreams, when I get up in the morning and I try and explain to my wife what I just said, I'm like, what I just experienced, I'm like, I had a good dream about something and I can't quite remember what. That's how I usually describe the dreams. They're not with this kind of detail, right? So I think there's something remarkable about this vision that John has. And there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. The main character in the book of Revelation is obviously Jesus, right? That's who's being revealed. But you know what the main prop is in the book of Revelation? The throne. 47 times in these 22 chapters, John will talk about the throne. Jesus will mention the throne. In 17 different chapters, the throne is kind of the central figure. So as you've been reading through Revelation out loud, I asked you to do that 3 chapters a week. Pay attention to how often the throne is mentioned. So he pulls back the curtain, and there, seated on the throne, is the one that was worthy. The only real king. Here's the first thing I think we discover in this chapter is that the one who sits on the throne, this Jesus, he is our king, he is our judge, he is our warrior, he is our priest. Those were the only 4 types of people who sat on thrones in that day. The only people that sat on the thrones or in the thrones or in the throne rooms and on the thrones were these 4 types of people. And John calls attention to it. We see Jesus here, he's a king. Kings sit on thrones. That's a pretty obvious one, right? But judges sit on thrones. They have ultimate authority. I think it's okay to share this. She's not in the room, so I can't ask. I'll have her, I don't even know if we're recording today, so it's probably okay. But Marsh asked for prayers for her, I think it's her niece's son, who is going to trial this week. And his fate for vehicular manslaughter will be in the hands of a judge. And you can imagine how torn up the family is. Imagine that every family here has had somebody that struggled with that. If you can't think of who that was, it was probably you. But we've all had those moments where we come before a judge, and we'll all have a moment where we'll come before a judge. Judge sits on a throne. Actually, a warrior back then would sit on the throne. Maybe we've seen that portrayed at times in the movies where they carry the head of the battle through on kind of this throne. But I think more common it was to desecrate the throne of the king that they've just vanquished. We don't really experience that in our day, but I do remember coming home one day and my kids telling me, "Did you see what happened to Saddam Hussein?" You know, we know how to insult our enemies. And that's, I think, what this was about for the warrior. The warrior would defeat their enemy, conquer the kingdom, and sit on that king's throne. It was a stolen throne, but it was a throne nonetheless. And then a priest would sit on a throne. In the sanctuary, in the temple, they had a special seat for the priest. And so think about this role of Jesus on the throne, where he is now the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, which we'll read about in another passage later on, chapter 19. He's the king. He rules the nation, and we are all under his sovereignty at this point. He's the sovereign one. He's the judge. In John chapter 5, Jesus says the Father's entrusted all judgment to the Son. He is the judge. He gets the final say, the last word. He's the conquering warrior, Colossians 2. I didn't put this one on the screen, but he is this conquering warrior. And he conquered on the cross, which is kind of backwards. Usually the conquered end up on crosses. But he conquered with the cross. Jesus is all of these things: King of Kings, Judge of sin, conquering warrior, mediating priest. The priest sat on a throne to mediate between God and man and God. This was the image that John finds himself before. The king, the judge, the warrior, the priest. He's all of them. kind of want to pause for a moment and go back to the Old Testament. There's so many images in this chapter from the Old Testament that you almost start to think, did John just plagiarize this whole thing? Like, is he just rewriting the Old Testament into the New Testament? And I don't know that I would call it plagiarism, but we see the beauty of it over and over. In a minute, we're going to read about the throne room. We've already read about it once this morning. But he says, this is what I saw before the throne. Well, this is an old vision. Now, one of my favorite little prayers to read in the Old Testament is in Habakkuk 3. We're not going to read the favorite part. My favorite part is towards the end, like 17, 18, 19, where Habakkuk's like, even though we're starving, I will praise you, God. You know, he just has this beautiful attitude towards worship. But at the beginning of this prayer, he says, Lord, I have heard of your fame, and I stand in awe of your deeds. Lord, repeat them in our day, in our time, make them known. In wrath, remember mercy. That's a great prayer. You know, every once in a while, these things will make their way through living rooms. You'll see them on, framed in plaques, sometimes embroidered, or they'll be on T-shirts, these famous prayers. Like, do you remember the Old Testament prayer, the prayer of, I forgot his name now. Thank you. The prayer of Jabez makes its way through. And that prayer is not really actually that great of a prayer when you look at it. I don't think we're actually supposed to be in prayer for our prosperity, no matter how many preachers decided this would be the theme for their church for the year. The prayer of Jabez, that God will increase my borders and make me more prosperous. But the prayer of Habakkuk here, this belongs on T-shirts, or at least written on our mirrors or on an inner page of our Bible somewhere, Lord, I have heard of your fame. I stand in awe of your deeds. Repeat them in our day. Isn't that what you're longing for right now, is for God to act today the way he did many times before? It's like when Max Lucado got up and framed a prayer for the entire country after September 11th, and his simple prayer was, do it again, Lord. Do it again. And he talked about how God has freed countries and freed people and brought peace in the midst of conflict and health in the midst of distress. And do it again, Lord. That's really what this prayer is of Habakkuk's. Do it again, Lord. He says, God came from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. His glory covered the heavens, and his praise filled the earth. And here's where it reminds us of John's vision. His splendor was like the sunrise. Rays flashed from his hand where his power was hidden. Like God holding back his power, ready to unleash it. The rays escaping between the knuckles. It's a beautiful vision of the power of God and of who God is. Another great picture of the throne room of God comes to us from Ezekiel. And I wish we could just read this whole chapter and start at verse 1, but I want to read this part. This is what reminds me of John's vision. Above the vault, over their heads, was what looked like a throne of lapis lazuli. What color is that? Blue? Okay. So basically like my eyes, right? Or maybe something like Barbara's shirt, or it's just this beautiful blue, right? And high above on the throne was a figure that was like that of a man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal. Like this beautiful metal statue of a man, I guess, from the waist up. Censored, not like the statue David, But from the waist up, he looked like glowing metal. As if full of fire. And then from there down, he looked like fire. And brilliant light surrounded him. Do you get the picture? This is what Ezekiel saw. Now, if you remember Ezekiel chapter 1, a lot of people love to look at this one, especially like if they read the King James. They love to look at this one and say, look, Ezekiel saw an alien. The big wheel is interpreted as this flying saucer. And, they love to go through that little Ezekiel chapter 1. Kids love to read that chapter. Like, use your imagination. Draw this scene of heaven. It's a beautiful scene. But we forget that really the point of that whole chapter is about this one. He looked like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. You know what that is? It's hope. We know rainy days around here, right? And then the rainbow comes out. There's hope on the horizon when the rainbow comes out. Like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day, so was the radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking. What I want us to understand here is that not only is Ezekiel's vision similar, his response is similar to John's. When he gets this picture of God, he falls before him in worship. I think too often we think worship is about us. I went to worship yesterday. We sang the best songs. We heard the best band. We suffered through a long sermon. It was an amazing day, right? I just felt really special after being with the church yesterday. But that's not really what worship is. Worship should bring us to this point where we see God in such a way our words are taken right out of our mouth. There's a heaviness in our chest as our spirit wrestles with what doesn't belong in us anymore and wants to purge us of it. There should be this moment where we realize that we are before the Holy of Holies. We are there. God is with us and we are with God. And that vision of who God is so much bigger than anything else we can see or imagine, that it drives us to our knees or prone on the floor. Like Ezekiel and like John. In the throne room, we should see the one who sits on the throne, worthy to receive glory, honor, and power. Now, in our lives, we give glory and honor and power to many people and many things. Sometimes we want the glory, right? And so we've got the list of accomplishments and the resume, the things that we've done, and we're the star of our own stories every time we sit down and eat a meal with people and talk about things. We're it, man. We are the pinnacle. We get the glory. Nobody else has given us the glory, so we'll just go ahead and seek it from one another. Honor. It isn't even something that people pursue anymore, to live honorably. Power. Boy, we all want that. But Jesus has these things. He is worthy to receive glory, honor, and power, and he has them. But he wants them from us as well. And that's what we see happen in this throne room. Picking up at verse 4, surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones. I tried to kind of create a similar idea, threw in a couple extra chairs today. Ironically, there's like 24 of us here today, which is kind of funny. But these 24 elders surround the throne, and this is far from a throne, but this image of Christ at the center. And the elders are giving him all the glory and honor. They were dressed in white, and by the way, we kind of picked up on this a little bit in the first few chapters in Revelation. You know what it meant to be dressed in white? It meant to be purified. And one of those cities is sitting there going, yeah, we know white linen. We sell it. But to be dressed in our deeds was kind of the idea of chapters 1, 2, and 3. And their deeds, they were holy and pure. Who are these 24 elders? Well, a lot of people have speculated, It could be the 12 tribes of Israel or the 12 sons of Jacob with now the 12 apostles. You get to 24 pretty quickly there. I just think they represent the disciples who follow Jesus, the people who follow Jesus. I don't know that they're meant to be specifically identified in the who's who, because the point is they're giving glory to the one who's who, not to themselves. I think that's part of the reason they're not named here. If their names were important, they would be here, right? It's not what we're supposed to understand. What we're supposed to understand is surrounding God are those who have lived faithfully for Him, led faithfully for Him. They're the people who live and love and lead like Jesus. And so Jesus has them close in this inner circle, continuing. They were dressed in white and had on crowns of gold on their heads. Do you remember the word crown from anywhere else in the New Testament? The crown is basically considered the prize or the reward in the New Testament. And so some suggest that these gold crowns had been given to the 24 as rewards for their work. And what did they do with them? From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumbling, and peals of thunder. And in front of the throne, 7 lamps. We'll come back to what they do with them. This is the setting. From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. By the way, in the Old Testament, when that happens, that's usually a signal that God is physically present. Like when Moses gets the 10 Commandments, same setting. The earth shakes, thunder claps, and lightning. And it's the symbol of His power and of His presence. And so from the throne, not the 24 thrones, but the throne, came flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. In front of the throne, 7 lamps were blazing. And these are the 7 spirits of God. And I've walked through this a few times. There's a couple of scriptures. We'll read one of them here in a little bit. But like in Ezekiel's vision of the Son of Man, there's 7 times that it talks about, the spirit of this man. And there's 7 different qualities about that spirit. And you could try and push this that far and say, this is what he meant by the 7 spirits. I just think he's talking about the fullness of the Holy Spirit beyond the presence of one being. But the fullness and the magnitude of the Holy Spirit is so big. There's so much. And 7 is a sign of completion in their thought. And so this is the complete Holy Spirit before the throne of God. So you have Father, Son, Holy Spirit all there at the throne. I think that's kind of what we're seeing here is that Trinity. In verse 6 it says, also in front of the throne there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. Now for us, we know a little bit about seas. Being here in the Gulf of America and the Gulf territory, we understand that water has significant impact, right? It aligns our coast, and it can ravage our coast. I watched a video this week trying to learn a little bit about Louisiana. And they were talking about how basically half of Louisiana is just the stuff that flowed downstream in the Mississippi and created this delta. Like most of it wouldn't be there. So trying to get a foundation for anything is rough. Evidently you go out there and you dig and in the delta, and it doesn't take more than a couple of shovelfuls before you hit water. I imagine that's why they bury people above ground, right? So this idea of water being powerful is something that we think of. We also think of the prosperity of water because of our ports, because of our imports and our exports, because of the oil that we pick up and we push out of this place. That water has impact on us, and it did for them too. When John sees this sea, understand that the sea in their world could be a great blessing, but it could also bring great devastation. And picture this. Have you ever been out in a storm on the Gulf? I remember one time we were riding on the ferry, over at Bolivar, riding the ferry, and there were huge heaves, and we got stuck out there. It's usually like a 15, 20-minute ferry ride. We were out there about an hour. And it was just swells, but the main reason was the power was out at the landing, and so the generators were out, there was no power, we couldn't land. And I was talking to this guy on the deck of the ferry that worked there. I said, what's the longest you've ever been stuck out here? He said, a few weeks ago we were stuck out here for 12 hours. It's like, I don't want that. I'll miss work tomorrow if that's the case. He said, no, we had these huge storm surges and we just couldn't land. It was devastating. Imagine John, he doesn't have a weather app on his phone, and he's trapped on this little bitty island about 10 miles long and a couple of miles wide, and the storms rage. Where does he go? What's he do? The sea in their day was a symbol of chaos. It was to be feared because it had taken family members and friends. It had devastated villages along the coastline. So when John looks and sees this sea, in his vision, what's the sea doing? It's just still. I can't help but think, I wonder if John remembered back when this time when he was in this boat and the storm came up and the boat was bouncing all over and Jesus was sound asleep. And he comes out and he stills the storm with his voice. So he sees this sea as still as glass. Could you imagine? I've been down to the Gulf a few times, and that thing's just always pounding. The waves are pulsating. It's coming and coming. Could you imagine if the ocean itself was still? I don't know about you, but I need to hear that today. That despite the chaos around me, God is still in control, and he can still the sea. It's one of the characteristics that we look at. It's part of what leads us to worship. Next part of this verse says, in the center around the throne were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and in back. I know it's a creepy version. I mean, we read it earlier. It's like eyes under the armpits. Who wants eyes like that? You know what I mean? But the idea here is the creatures are around the throne. These all-powerful, these very these things that we're filled in awe with as we look at them and try to imagine them. Like, we could go through and try and identify who are the 4 living creatures. But I think what we're actually supposed to pick up here is just the fact that in the midst of this chaos and the storms that were surrounding, the sea is now glass, and the creatures, they're essentially tamed. I don't mean that they're tame creatures. If you look at them, they sound pretty significant, but they're still submitting to the sovereignty of God. And we could go through and try and figure out who these creatures are. There's great hints from the Old Testament. But the bottom line is they submit themselves to God in the midst of this. Goes on to say, the first living creature was like a lion. The second was like an ox. The third had a face like a man. And the fourth was like a flying eagle. All of those are crazy critters, aren't they? Even the face of the man. I don't know if there's anything scarier than the face of a man, and I don't know how you women put up with it. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes all around. Even under its wings, day and night, they never stopped saying, oh, this is our part, holy, 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 who was and is to come. just over and over. It's not their eyes that are commented on here. It's their posture before this holy Lord. And it probably takes that many eyes to really see and absorb the Lord's glory in that way. Again, I think John is not necessarily intending to plagiarize, but from that chapter I started earlier in Ezekiel chapter 1, look at the description there. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf, gleamed and burnished in bronze. Oh, I skipped too far ahead. I put these in the wrong order. Just a minute here. Let's start here. I looked, and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal. And in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. And in appearance, their form was human. But each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. So they're missing a couple of wings in this image. But their legs were straight and their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed with burnished bronze. I'm going to read to you the other part of this vision, which evidently I didn't put in my slides. Verse 10. Verse 8. Under their wings and on their 4 sides they had the hands of a man. And all 4 of them had faces and wings. Not just one face, but they had multiple faces and wings. And their wings touched one another. Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side had the face of a lion, and on the left side a face of an ox, and each also had the face of an eagle. This is a pretty amazing creature, isn't it? And you can read this whole chapter later today, Ezekiel chapter 1. But here's what you'll notice. Ezekiel never explains the creature. He explains the glory of the Lord that the creatures are pointing to. And so you can do your homework. You can try and research these creatures, and you can probably find some interesting, I guess would be the word I would use, explanations as to, who was the lion and who was the ox and who was the eagle and what was the face of the man, who was the man. You can go through and figure that out. But at the end of your study, what you need to come back to and understand is that it's not the creatures that are the focus. It's the response of the creatures to the one who is worthy. And the same is true in Revelation. He doesn't delineate who these creatures are. He just says, the creature said this, "You are worthy, O Lord our God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things." Now, when I read that line, I picture this creature with the face of an ox and the face of a man and the face of an eagle, the face of a lion, saying, "You created all things, even these crazy things." All of these crazy things that we're seeing, at your will they were created and have their being. And that's the point of this part of John's vision. You and I were created at the will of God. And we're created to surrender to that sovereignty of the will of God. The 24 elders fell down before him, who sits on the throne, and worship him who lives forever and ever. And they lay their crowns before the throne, and they say, feel like I've got those in the wrong order too. Starting at verse 9, whenever the living creatures give glory, honor, and thanks to him who sits on the throne and who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay their crowns before the throne and say, you are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory, honor, and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being. So we said that the crowns that they're laying down were rewards for their good works. So I have a couple of questions just for application as we wrap this up today. The first one would be this, one day you're going to have a crown for the good work that you've done, potentially. I don't know if you're going to be one of the 24 elders sitting there in close proximity to the throne, but there is this concept of we're competing for a prize. My hope would be one day you'll lay that crown down. But what good works do you want to be celebrated about you? What do you want to be rewarded for? I want you to think about that. In a moment, we're going to listen to a song. And first of all, I really appreciate all that Lindy did to prepare this service despite being gone. I think those first two videos that we watched were actually from the IF gathering, which we'll talk about here in just a moment. But that picture that it painted of, the king was a beautiful picture. We're going to have one more song about the King of Kings. And during that song, I want to invite you back on this table. It's crafts time. It's arts and craft time. There are thrones. Maybe you'll recognize them. The kids wore them in the Christmas program. And I'd love you to take one of those, I said thrones, I meant crowns. Take one of those crowns, and there's a Sharpie back there. And I want you to just on the inside, not the part that everybody sees, but write what it is you want to be rewarded for someday. You might write, I want to be rewarded for my faithfulness. I want to be rewarded for the way I put up with my husband. I want to be rewarded for raising godly children. I want to be rewarded for, publishing a book on EDM. Whatever it is that you want to be rewarded for, I want you to write that on there. What is the good work that God has been doing in you and through you? And then I'm not going to have you surrender those to me because I might recognize your handwriting or something like that. But I do want you to surrender your good works to the Lord. But I want you to take this crown with you and put it somewhere in the house where you'll see it this week, where it'll remind you to do good work. And then, by the time we gather again Sunday, I'd like you to offer that crown back to him and surrender it to him and say, Lord, all my good works are yours. Anything good in my life, it's just a reflection of who you are and what you've done. And my response is not to seek glory and honor, but to seek glory and honor for you. So while the song plays, I'd like you to do that. I'd like you to surrender your crown to the only one worthy.